Why I think this is so important is that when we're doing therapy and people are remembering traumatic events, knowing that they can be repackaged and stored in the brain differently than they were when that event first happened. This is why we would even ask someone to talk about or to remember this horrible thing, is that we can change it.
Hello and welcome. We're so glad you're tuning into the Taking Good Care show. I'm Dr. Andrew Wong, based in Toronto, Canada.
And I'm Dr. David St. Arnaud, based in Edmonton, Canada. We're two practicing psychologists with over a decade of experience each, working in a variety of settings and supporting diverse populations.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. While we're both practicing psychologists, our podcast is intended purely for educational and entertainment purposes. It's not a substitute for professional mental health care or treatment. If you're in need of support, we strongly encourage you to reach out to a licensed mental health professional in your area.
All right, welcome back, Andrew.
Second recording of the morning, or I guess afternoon on my end now. And we're gonna talk more about trauma today. I know we had Dr. Janice Dicks on a few episodes ago, giving us, I think, more of a theoretical overview of trauma and how trauma impacts many of us, and understanding the whole compartmentalization of trauma in our brains, how it can impact us. And I think today we're going to still talk about trauma, but maybe take it in a little bit of a different direction.
Yeah, I think we can, just from our experience, our clinical experience, maybe highlight some things that would be helpful for listeners. And again, this isn't going to be like a comprehensive overview, and we're going to try not to repeat what was said in Dr. Janice Dix's episode with us. So, if you're interested in this and you haven't listened to that one, maybe go back, have a listen to that one. We're going to be it's more our style to just have a conversation, and we don't have a lot pre-planned. We have some, some things that we'd like to hit on, but we're going to see where this goes. The focus will be trauma and what this means and what this looks like for folks, and maybe some strategies and some ways of thinking about it that might help people out there.
Yep.
So
the way I see it, Dave, is that we are testing what we know through these podcasts.
Yeah, and maybe we'll be replaced by generative AI at some point, but at this point, I think we're just compiling a lot of what we've learned over the years in our training and in our learning and our experience, and sharing that with the world. So trauma is very popular right now, and again, it was not around 50 years ago. This has been kind of something that made its way into the diagnostic manual and the approaches, or the clinical kind of aspects of mental health, recognizing that events, experiences can have consistent kind of impacts. Often, with trauma, it's a negative impact, but there is also post-traumatic growth, so we can touch on that too. But we're looking at how do past events interfere with present functioning and current mental health, current functioning. And so, yeah, I'm trailing off here, so I need you to pick me up.
Well, I think going back to your point, Dave, about the discussion of trauma now is much more prevalent than it was years ago. Post-traumatic stress disorder, the diagnosis, has been around, but I think the idea of trauma has expanded a lot more in the last 20 years. Even as we think about, going back to our PhD, I remember completing my dissertation, and, it was on resilience and newcomer Canadians and what resilience meant. There's this whole idea of post-traumatic growth, right? So the whole growth, trauma literature went from what is trauma and all the negative impacts of trauma to talking about, okay, now we've experienced trauma, so what, right? What do we do with it, right? So just because we've experienced trauma now doesn't mean that we are stuck constantly in that traumatic state. We can move on from the trauma.
Yeah, we can. And, how do we actually do that? I think if you're alive and you're older than 10 years old, you've experienced some form of trauma, some overwhelming experience. This is, more my definition of it. I think this comes from EMDR training that I had. So it's an overwhelming experience that we were unprepared for. Right. And I think Janice talked about more of the control, not having
Hmm.
control in the situation. And there's a lot of overlap there.
Hmm.
But I really like the unprepared for, because we can look at like how we might prepare ourselves for similar events in the future, right? So
Yeah,
if you're a first responder, if you're a firefighter, right? Like there's going to be some overwhelming experiences, right?
that's
And
right.
even, we pre-screen for RCMP and stuff like that at our office. And how do we know if someone is, mentally, psychologically prepared or fit suited for a profession like that, right? And we're still learning a lot about this, but the idea that we can be prepared for
Hmm.
terrible, overwhelming experiences, and the fact that what does it look like when we're overwhelmed? What does it look like when our nervous system is overwhelmed by an experience?
I like what you said there, Dave. Being overwhelmed and unprepared, working with a lot of children. I think the idea of trauma often gets overlooked because we will think, oh, working with children, trauma equals perhaps abuse or
Hmm.
sexual abuse, neglect. But what sometimes gets overlooked is like bullying,
Hmm.
right? And going to what Janice said, I think she brought up a really good point. Trauma is sort of in the eye of the beholder, right? It's from that person's perspective. Some children may deal with bullying better than others, right? And so they may be a little bit more resilient to being teased or bullied, whereas other children are not so hardy to bullying. And so for them, it becomes much more of a significant experience, perhaps even delving into the area of trauma, right? Something that happens over and over again of being either physically bullied or relationally bullied. That can be very overwhelming. And look, no child goes to school preparing to be bullied, right? So there's that unpreparedness as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and so again, the definition doesn't have specific types of events or experiences, but we can generally kind of have an idea of what kind of experiences might be overwhelming, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be overwhelming for everyone. So
Hmm.
not assuming because someone has been sexually abused that they are traumatized by it, right? Quite likely, absolutely, right? But just the assumption that someone has been through an experience or an event does, even when we look at 9/11 and the
Hmm.
Twin Towers going down, there was a lot of first responders that were there that survived, and not all had PTSD after,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Some had that spontaneous natural recovery, and others had lingering symptoms that continued to interfere with their life moving forward, right?
Well, I think that's why the experience piece, again, sometimes gets overlooked. I think a lot of people, at least in the community, especially perhaps first responders or people who go to war, sometimes when they come back, it gets overlooked because, oh, well, not everybody has PTSD, right? Well, I went and I'm fine,
Hmm.
right? And so why would the next person have a challenging time with it?
Yeah. Yeah. It's not clear cut,
Yeah.
right? And so sometimes, PTSD looks like irritability or all of a sudden like a change in personality where people are quite quiet and
Yeah.
distant and not participating in their family life anymore.
Yeah.
And they could have done a tour of, a military tour and come back. And it's like they don't even have an explanation or an understanding of what changed, but something has changed.
Yeah.
And so when we look at the diagnosis of PTSD, like there's a couple elements that are different than some of the other diagnoses, and there's a lot of overlap. When we look at the symptom checklist, right? Depressive symptoms are in there, absolutely. But there are more like intrusive thought kind of symptoms, avoidance strategies. So
Hmm.
avoiding reminders of events or, we call them, triggers in a lot of ways because they activate the reminder of that event, which is
Yes.
distressing. So,
Yes.
sounds, smells, movies, like things that we see, it could be
Hmm.
anything. It could be internal or external reminders that people without the help, they're going to naturally want to just avoid. And that might just close down their world. They won't go to malls. They won't go out, they won't drive in high traffic areas that
Yep.
like depending on what the trauma was.
Yep. I would even
Yeah.
say that it's more subtle in children because they may not necessarily have what we think of as flashbacks, like they're reliving the moment again. Probably see that a lot more in adults who have been through traumatic experiences. But in children, it's really the irritability, the change in behavior, or even some parents might say it's a change in personality. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be abuse or neglect. Going back to Sharon Smith's episode on divorce and separation, right? When divorce and separation is poorly managed or poorly executed, children can be traumatized by that too.
Hmm.
And so, I have had clients who will say, they are going through a separation and all of a sudden they see, their child acting very differently.
Hmm.
Right. And let's say it's not an amicable separation, a lot of yelling, a lot of arguments at home. I will talk to kids and they'll say, I try to cover my ears. I try to go to a quiet room. I try to not hear it. But unfortunately, they do hear a lot of things that perhaps they shouldn't hear. And they become very much negatively impacted by it. And so you see that irritability, they might go and hit a child at school, who took a toy from them or took their pencil when they were trying to write something. And usually their temperament is, you know what? I'm going to tell you that I don't like you taking my pencil, but this time I just whacked you upside the head. Right. And so why that change? Right. And so for kids, it's a little bit more nuanced. We have to observe their behaviors and in a safe environment, talk to them about what's been going on.
Yeah, being able to make sense of the experience, right, actually helps us, yeah, put it into context, put it like, but I want to, so two main things that I really want to make sure we cover. One is window of tolerance, and the other one is just talking about memory and how memory is actually stored in the brain and how it, what a little bit more about like memory and trauma memory. So, starting with window of tolerance, if you're not familiar with this, again, you can look this up. There's tons of stuff online, nice visuals. But for just listening, you want to picture kind of this range, this window, this kind of almost like a river, where within that, you're able to, at its simplest form, you're able to kind of notice what you are thinking and feeling, as well as what other people might be thinking and feeling, right? So you can be in a conversation, you can be aware of your thoughts, your emotions, your sensations, and also be attending to someone else speaking about something or even being aware of your environment, right? Those things are happening at the same time. And that someone might mention a word that is triggering for us or upsetting for us, but we might still be within our window of tolerance,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
On the top end, when we are outside of that window, that's what they call like the hyperactive. So that's the fight or flight. That is being really activated. People might be fidgeting, moving around. They might
Hmm.
actually physically run away. They might hit somebody. And a lot of this is outside of conscious awareness. Like it is quite reactionary.
Mm.
And so yeah, we want to be, really conscious that you're probably no longer aware of maybe other people or the environment or even kind of what's going on in your body or your thoughts. So you can pop into that top part or you can drop down into the bottom part. So picture that window again in the middle, and the bottom part is the freezing, the hypoactive, and that is the shutting down. Like if a bear is attacking you, it's like pretending you're dead, like just not moving. And it's again not really conscious a lot of times.
Yep.
We can dissociate, we can disconnect. So those are natural normal responses to overwhelming experiences.
And I think Janice did talk about the nervous system, right? And we see this in a lot of children as the hyperactive or the hyperarousal. They're just much more vigilant or even hypervigilant. You see a lot more of that perhaps anger or the anxiety, the difficulty sleeping, and like you said, the impulsivity, just getting angry quicker, less regulated with their emotions. Right.
Yeah.
And so in young children, when they experience negative events, perhaps even a traumatic event, you will see that hyperarousal.
Absolutely. And like nervous system, other words like the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, right? So the activation and being on high alert, that hypervigilance, that is a lot of like a common symptom for PTSD, right? Which makes a lot of sense. If your life was threatened, if your safety was threatened, then you might not feel safe anymore, right?
Yep.
You might be looking for danger. You might be trying to read for cues that to be able to prevent that thing from happening again. And that makes a lot of sense. So, again, when someone is typically or quote unquote like traumatized, you might see that they have a hard time relaxing.
Yep.
And
Uh,
so, just one more thing, like the
yep.
sympathetic
Yep. Yep.
nervous
Yep.
system,
Yep.
right? Like what goes along with that? I like the phrase like rest and digest, right? So we're able to do a lot of the regular maintenance stuff that our body needs to do to kind of have like that long life, right? The fight or flight, freeze response, those are like crisis responses that are not good to be kind of in for sustained periods of time over, long. It should be short, it should be save your life, and then you should be able to return back down to this baseline of rest and digest. And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that's why too, when we experience a traumatic event and it's not processed, we're not receiving any help for it, it becomes really challenging because our brain, that hyper aroused brain, just goes to danger, 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 right?
Hmm.
The sirens going off and you just think the worst, right? Because we're so hyper aroused, we're so hyper vigilant. Our brain now, the wiring has been changed. Someone has
Hmm.
rewired it to just think danger. When really, if you were to step back and take a look at the situation, or someone else was looking at the situation, it's just like, oh, it's a fire truck going somewhere. I don't know where, but
Hmm.
that's all it is.
I love that. Like that is, that is a great one because we hear sirens all the time, especially if you live in a big city, right? And that can be a trigger. That can be a cue, a reminder that if I'm working with someone and we're in my office and there's sirens outside and I notice they stop breathing, right? And it's like they're not even conscious of it. It was just a sound that was happening in the background, but all of a sudden it cued their nervous system to,
That's right.
it's dangerous or something bad is going to happen or something bad could happen.
That's
Right.
right.
And we're hardwired for that. Like that is the species, like our, mammalian species, right? We should be sensitive to danger and learn from past experiences.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
But unfortunately, we don't, from trauma, we typically don't learn,
Yes.
right? In the
Yes.
same way that we can learn, other things. So,
Yep.
what you said just brought up like, I want to talk about memory and how like we remember or we encode these kinds of experiences. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, why don't we go there now? Right? The way we encode experiences and our memory impacts the way we understand our trauma, which is interesting. I mean, a lot of research in the past has shown our memories are not the most accurate ways of storing information.
Yeah. Which I think is super important to highlight because I learned this in, I think, a third year neuropsych course in my undergrad, but it really like there was evidence, there was research with rats learning things and
Hmm.
like it was pretty complicated research, but they found that the actual memories changed every time they were remembered.
Hmm.
So, so much of our justice system and like these things are, you know, assuming that our memories are actually pretty accurate, right? Eyewitness testimony. But guess what? Every time you remember something, you're actually re encoding it. into your brain, and it can be a bit different each time, right? And we can create false memories, right?
Yes.
There's research around that. So understanding that our memories change every time we remember them.
And even the power of suggestion in terms of our memories. So that's why when you read any kind of interrogation literature, especially some of the classic ones, they talk about the way a detective may ask a question can actually, like you said, falsify that memory, but the person reporting it can actually see it as true.
Or even just how intense it was, or how, like, so there was some research on calling a motor vehicle accident an accident or a collision, and just
That's
using
right.
different words
That's right.
changed people's perception and recollection of what they saw.
Yep.
So, why I think this is so important is that when we're doing therapy and people are remembering traumatic events, knowing that they can be repackaged and stored in the brain differently than they were when that event first happened.
Hmm.
This is why we would even ask someone to talk about or to remember this horrible thing, is that we can change it.
Let me ask you, Dave, because I think you're probably more well versed in this area. But let's say somebody who's reporting an event that they experienced could have been from months ago, could have been from years ago, and they're seeing it from their perspective, and they're reporting it from their memory, their recall. Doesn't matter, I guess, how accurate it is, because I sort of get stuck on that point of, okay, if it's their experience and that's their reporting,
Mm-hmm.
what, A, what can you do with it? I mean, that's what they're reporting. And B, does it matter if it's accurate or not? Or how much does it matter in terms of accuracy, I guess?
I mean, for the individual, unless there's like some court case involved and they're
Yeah.
going to have to prove, what happened, that like we're not so focused on the facts. We're more, or at least I'm more focused on the impact. What were the beliefs, the conclusions, the emotions, right, that were experienced at that time, and being able to revisit it in a safe, supportive environment can maybe the facts stay the same, but the feeling of it changes.
Mm.
And when we talk about memories, normal, typical kind of like episodic memories have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? Think about the last birthday you had, right? You can talk about what happened right before, the day before, and then what happened that day. And you can walk through like, this happened next, this happened next. With traumatic memories, for a lot of people, they're fractured, they're scattered, they're disorganized, they're not in the same kind of beginning, middle, and end. They might just go like, oh, this happened, and then this happened, but maybe that happened before. I'm not sure. And then there was this sound, and it really is kind of hard to you know bring the pieces of the puzzle together.
Hmm.
And I think that is part of what we do in therapy, is that we might be able to create a narrative, right? And it might not be totally accurate, we might not have all the facts,
Yeah.
but there's some narrative. And at minimum, I like to remind people that they survived, that they're
Mm.
here now telling me about the thing that happened back then.
That's really cool, actually, that I survived.
Hmm.
That I survived.
Because in that moment, that kid who was caught in that house that was on fire, right? And when they're in my office and they're back there re-experiencing that event, because again, when we remember things, we re-experience it to some degree.
Yeah.
And I can say, you got out of there, you survived,
Yeah.
right? And they can hold that as like true
Yeah.
while also still being quite terrified.
Yeah.
Right? We can have dual consciousness. We can know that we're right here, right now, talking about something in the past, but also re experiencing it.
And we can safely talk about it.
We can, if we're in our window of tolerance,
Yes.
right? So, as a trauma focused therapist, I'm always assessing whether someone is in their window of tolerance as they are talking about something horrible, right?
I remember years ago when I was still working with the school board, there was a girl, middle school aged, who was really having a hard time at school, emotionally, academically, and the staff at the school really wanted me to see her, not for an assessment, but more so for counseling. And At that time, even to this day, school boards don't do a lot of counseling, but they were really concerned about her because of something that she had disclosed to the teacher. And speaking to your window of tolerance, meeting a person, a healthcare professional for the first time is not easy. Right? So I met her and she didn't say a thing the whole session. Right. And in a school, you have to be pretty flexible. You might not have that hour session. I don't remember now, it's so long ago, but maybe it was about 40 minutes. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I had a piece of paper ready, had a pencil, maybe some pencil crayons. And we're talking about like maybe a 12, 13-year-old here. And didn't say much, started drawing a little bit, fiddling and just sketching a little bit. And I think there was the hypo arousal at the time. Like, I'm just going to not do anything. I'm not going to emote. I'm going to stay really, neutral about everything and looked pretty tired, like pretty sullen and pretty tired. And I remember just getting into that zone of, okay, you know what? Yeah, let's just draw. Right? Let's just draw. Let's just write whatever it is you want to do. Right? Because I could tell she was outside of that window of tolerance, very hypo
Mm-hmm.
aroused. So the other side of hyper aroused. But I remember the second time I saw her was within the same week. And again, this is just rapport building. This is just her getting to know me and me getting to know her. Continued to just write, very quiet, very silent. But she started to write words, words that could convey some meaning. For example, again, I don't remember specifically now, but like sad, right? SAD.
Mm-hmm.
And she would draw around it and sketch around it. And I remember not really responding with words, but I would pick up my pencil and I would write underneath, tell me more, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she would write another word. And then I would just write another couple words underneath that. And I could tell that she was getting into the window of tolerance,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, this was a sexual abuse case. It ended up, she ended up disclosing that, but it takes time. And I think the other piece too, speaking of that window of tolerance, it's taking some creativity to adapt to whatever that person needs to help them find that window of tolerance.
Yeah. Yeah, and assessing that window of tolerance, because especially with the hypo, when someone disappears, when someone dissociates, when someone,
Mm-hmm.
it might look like they're off, like thinking about something. You might have asked them a question, but
Mm-hmm.
really they're gone. So,
Yeah.
some of the ways that I'll do this in my office is if we're reprocessing an event, if we're talking about something, and all of a sudden the person is, I'm not sure if they're even like hearing me anymore. I will raise my voice, I will move closer,
Mm-hmm.
I will say, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And again, this might seem kind of weird for folks that have not really experienced major
Mm-hmm.
trauma, but for those that have, again, you you meeting with her might have been triggering in and of itself, right? And so I have a similar learning experience that I had in my master's practicum. So I was very new to this, was not very like trauma informed, even though like there was some education about it, but to actually see it in in real, like in the office. So I was at a school board. I was going around to different schools and meeting with kids for counseling and psychoed assessments. And I had this one student, and I can't even remember how old or what, but and I don't want to give a lot of details about it, but just picture this child. I'm meeting with this child, and part of the referral, part of the information that I was given to meet with this child is that there had been abuse that had occurred. So I think it was like our second or third session. I let the child know that, like, someone told me this, someone let me know that this has happened to you, right? And we continued with our, kind of like you were saying, rapport building, kind of, nothing seemed off, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we finished the session, and a lot of these kids, when they're in the school, they'll meet with me and then they go back to their class, right? And so the next class that this kid had was gym class. And
Mm.
so I was still in the same office and I was making my notes and doing prep for the next person that I was going to be seeing or what I was doing next. And all of a sudden, out of the window of that door, I see this kid being brought down to the office.
Mm.
And I'm like, oh, what is happening here? So I go over to the office and the teacher tells the front desk person, like, I don't know what's wrong with him, but and he was completely what we call dysregulated, right? Outside of that window of tolerance, another word for that is dysregulated. And so this child's face was red, that like really hyperactive, right? And almost disconnected from the environment around. Like the teacher could not even communicate. And so really almost like nonverbal. And there was a whole bunch going on. And I'm like, oh crap.
Yeah.
That was from what I mentioned. And it had a bit of a delay. He was able to kind of get through our session without showing that. But as he was probably kind of thinking about it or being triggered by it, or even just reflecting that I knew something that he hadn't told me, that showed up like in like a trauma response that the
Yes.
teacher has no idea, right? And so that's why
Hmm.
we talk more about like trauma informed, is because like teachers and hospitals and these places, like it might just be like, what's wrong with this kid, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think being able to take that lens, at least be aware of it and to monitor it, whether you're an educator or a healthcare professional, it's really important. Otherwise, like you said, you just sort of miss it. And you just
Hmm.
think, oh, this child is just misbehaving without understanding the context,
Yeah.
right?
Or
Or
they're
this
really
person.
hyper. They must have had a bunch of sugar and they're not listening right now, right?
Yeah,
Especially in gym class, right? They might just be running around and
yeah,
the gym teacher's blowing the whistle and being like, "Okay, we're doing this now," and they're not even, they're in their own world,
yeah.
right?
Or if someone
Yeah.
misses work a lot and, we just think of them as like a bad employee,
Hmm.
right? When we don't really know what's going on. So having that trauma-informed lens is very important. I think as a therapist, as a healthcare professional, just understanding that and being on the lookout for it.
Yeah, and even going back to memory, right? So for some people, they can have really detailed moment by moment, like every piece of what happened is encoded, and it's like that flashbulb memory that,
Hmm.
you know, but others might have blank spaces where there's just blackout and there is no memory and they don't even
Hmm.
know what really happened, right?
Yeah,
And both of those are normal, natural responses to trauma,
yeah,
but they're on the opposite ends of the extremes,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so when we look at like eyewitness testimony or having people sit up on a stand and recall things that happened to them from a trauma informed perspective, like we're getting better. Like we're having like emotional support animals available where people
Hmm.
can help kind of stay regulated while they're talking about something terrible.
Yeah.
But in a lot of ways, we can make people, or we can present or ask questions, or lawyers can, you know, create doubt about someone's credibility
Absolutely.
because they can't remember or they don't know or they said things that weren't in the right order.
So, Dave, I want to take this to the next direction then,
Okay.
in terms of trauma, and that's post-traumatic growth. We alluded to it a little bit earlier, and the reason why I want to take it there is because, okay, so let's say somebody has experienced trauma, right? And I know Janice talked about this in terms of, how do we work with it and so on. But there's, I would say, in the last 10 to 15 years, a lot more talk about this idea of post-traumatic growth. So, are you comfortable taking it there?
I am. I just want to mention one
Sure.
more thing before we go into post traumatic growth. And if anyone is listening to this and is triggered, right, that some of their past is showing up right now, I want you to do whatever you can to kind of connect yourself to the present moment, right? Whether that's, rubbing your hands on your thighs or rubbing your hands together, smelling the air, that you're like connecting with your five senses
Hmm.
and just bringing yourself back to this present moment and a little bit out of that memory or that past experience.
So this is what we would call grounding, some grounding
Hmm.
activities.
Hmm. And again, when we think of memories I think about the continuum. So one is we're all the way back there, we're having a flashback and we have no connection to our present moment, right? Versus being completely present centered and nothing from the past is kind of in our consciousness or our awareness, and think that you can move kind of between those spaces. And so you want to bring yourself more to the present state while also, you still might be remembering something. You still might know something happened, and, take a sip of water.
Hmm.
Be able to connect yourself right here, right now. And if you're working with a trauma-informed therapist, that's what they'll be doing. They're going to help you because that allows you to get back into your window of tolerance, right?
That's right.
Okay,
That's
now
right.
let's go to post-traumatic growth.
Well, now that you started on that path, I was just going to add to that too. That importance of grounding is, working with anyone, if you've gone through trauma, it's something that's really important to learn because whether you are with someone else or sometimes, look, you might just be by yourself at home, on the bus, at school, at work, and you're having sort of these negative memories, flashbacks, dissociations. It's important to have practiced and to employ or use these grounding exercises so that you can bring yourself back into a safe space without the reliance on somebody else to help you get there. So, like Dave said, rubbing your hands together, looking out at the blue sky, feeling the floor under your feet, feeling the back of your chair, whatever that might be, to just bring you back to the present moment.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think just adding one more thing to that is that for those that don't have memories, right? And you might just actually be experiencing the trigger, just
Yeah.
being like, I don't know why this is weird. Every time I get on the public transit bus, right, my heart rate goes up. I start sweating. I'm having a panic attack. So you don't even need to know where it's coming from. You don't need to have the memory. You can just start to kind of ground yourself in the present moment, right? And be able to be aware of that window of tolerance, bring yourself back into that window of tolerance, and have almost like a mini toolbox of things that really help you connect to right here, right now. And even that phrase, like that was then, this is now, right? You start looking around at what is around you. How can you connect with the present moment? That is, you're going to do this over and over again, especially for people that have been through a lot of traumatic stuff in the past. You're
Exactly.
constantly working at that.
Okay. Nice. So now we can go to post-traumatic growth. It's so funny, right? Like having these conversations, I think all the listeners can sort of see like we've just got so much to say about each topic. And with one statement from one person, it can just sort of trigger something, some other thought
Hmm.
that now we have something more to say. But yeah, post-traumatic growth, it's like, okay, what do you do with trauma, right? Like you've had this experience. And a part of it is, yes, let's manage it. Let's acknowledge that it's happened. And, let's continue moving on and let's keep plugging away with life and with our lived experiences. But there is this area of research called post-traumatic growth. And like I said, during my dissertation, this was probably back in 2012, 2011. This idea of post-traumatic growth started to emerge, and it was a term coined by Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun in their research. And it's the experience of positive change that occurs as a result of the struggle with a major life crisis or a traumatic event. And it's important to note here that it's not about bouncing back or being resilient. And it's not saying that we have to live through struggle in order to grow. It's the idea of, how do you grow forward in the face of unexpected events?
The way that I describe it is like it's not all bad, right? And we
Right.
might be focusing on a lot of the negative impacts of that event on your life. And especially, if it happened in childhood and it is, you've lived through a lot of loss or a lot of pain, right? That is absolutely still true. And there could be some positive that came from the negative, right?
Hmm.
And start to look at that as like kind of a more of a balanced approach to the
Hmm.
way this event impacted you and has continues to impact you, right?
Yeah. And it's really important too. I just want to add, I think for the listeners, it doesn't mean that trauma was a good thing.
No.
So we're not trying to reframe like, oh, yeah, no, that trauma was very positive at the end of the day. No, that's not what we're trying to say here.
Yeah, most people would not choose to go through the trauma to get the positive thing that came from it, right? Like,
Exactly.
but the fact that you went through it, that you didn't have a choice, right? That's already happened.
Hmm.
Now we can look at like what are some of those positive aspects that might have developed that came from this negative thing. And do you have examples of this? Like,
Yeah, I'll
yeah.
go back to some of my research. So I know again when we think of trauma, where we've talked about like motor vehicle collisions, we've talked about abuse or neglect or sexual abuse. I'll bring in a new one. And through my research back at the U of A, it was working with refugees, right? Refugee newcomer Canadians. And that in and of itself, having to live in a refugee camp, nobody chooses to, right? But you're displaced. You're displaced from the place that you once called home. And now you're living in limbo. You don't belong in any country. You're being told that you have to live here because you don't belong anywhere. And, I worked with a population that came to Canada, sort of just chosen to go to university, in the refugee camps. They did well studying. And it's almost like a double trauma in the sense that going to a refugee camp first in and of itself is traumatic. And refugee camps are not, don't think of it as these places as like a safe haven because they're not, right? They are dangerous places and people with dangerous motives as well within refugee camps. But then they come to Canada, again, going to a new place again, no family, completely different environment, even different weather a lot of the time, not knowing how to navigate the system whatsoever. And this is your second trauma. Now, interestingly, though, in interviewing and working with a number of these individuals, there were those who were able to adapt more readily than others, and there were others who struggled. And those I would say who exhibited this idea of post traumatic growth, again, having gone through traumatic events, but then they emerge through this trauma with sort of a new perspective or new strengths. So pushing themselves, for example, to be like, you know what, I do have to ask for help. I can't do this on my own anymore. Right. I do need to go to, let's say, the academic counselor, or I do need to go to the church group and find some community. Right. So this idea that they found this strength to continue pushing on. And by doing so, they learned the value of networking, social networking, right? And that's how they find out information about their new place of that they're now calling home.
Hmm.
Right? So that I think is an example of post-traumatic growth. They never planned to do this, but they had to.
Yeah, and I think when trauma therapy goes well, like I've had clients say, at the end of reprocessing something, they're like, I can't believe I survived that. I can't believe that I'm here today. And the flip side to that is I'm pretty resilient. I can't like I was able to find a way to get through that. Right.
Mhm.
And so that can add like confidence and reassurance that like I can survive terrible things. I can get through hard things. Right. And again, not that we're going to push people to have those experiences to show their resilience, but that can be the flip side to it. It's like that and the level of sensitivity that people might have. They might have more compassion, sensitivity, understanding for other folks, right? That they wouldn't have had if they hadn't been through this thing, right? This event, right?
Mhm. Yeah. And it's a process to find that. Again, possibly through therapy, to understand that, hey, you know what? I did grow from this experience. I did find something within me that was maybe I never knew was even there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
Mm-hmm.
being able to go through the experience, but then find some sort of new strength, some sort of new value within them to say, okay, I have this now, right? I've grown from this experience.
Hmm. Yeah.
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 And again, like this might seem far-fetched for some people that are still in the midst of, just making sense of what has happened and why it happened and how it happened, all of that. But knowing that, like, hey, wait a minute, as you are living your life, as you are, what did Janice say? Something about like you basically you lived through that thing already,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
what can we take away from that that you might apply that moving forward in your life in a
Yeah.
positive way, right? So,
I also want to note too, on the flip side, is that you don't have to have post-traumatic growth,
yeah.
right? It's not a necessity if you go through trauma, right? So I just worry that people might think, oh, if I don't have post-traumatic growth, does that mean I failed in the
Hmm.
face of trauma and adversity? No, not at all, right?
Yeah.
Post-traumatic growth is, it's almost like the word that comes to mind is like a sequelae or like sort of an event that occurs for some, but not all.
Yeah, and I think the idea of post-traumatic growth is important in and of itself. Just knowing that trauma does not mean all bad, right?
Hmm.
But I don't want people, especially people that are not super informed, to kind of lead with that. It's like, well,
Hmm.
think about the positive, or like,
No,
think about the bright side of
no,
this. And
no,
you don't start there,
please
right?
don't go there.
Yeah.
Yeah, please don't.
Yeah. But that there can be some good that comes from some bad, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And when you were talking about refugee camps, I was thinking of this example that I have in my head. And I think this is just, I don't actually have a real life example of this. But if you had an experience where you were in this camp or you were in this place where dogs were used to like hunt people down, to chase
Hmm.
people, to
Hmm.
when you come to another country and dogs are like part of
Mm.
like just
Yep.
everybody loves dogs and they're awesome and they go to dog parks and they hang out and you can literally watch some people like freeze. And this, I mean, you could have a traumatic experience with a dog growing up in Canada here too, but not, these stimuluses are these things that have a positive association for so many people can have a traumatic triggering association for other people with other experiences. And that's what I learn about trauma all the time. Things that in my office that are not triggering for 99% of the population might have someone freezing up.
Exactly. So it's so important, again, I think, not just for trauma, but when we work with people in psychology, to really put ourselves in someone else's shoes. Right? I think your dog example is great. In Western society, we see dogs as obedient pets that are friendly and loving. And, you walk through the door, they come running at you, like best feeling ever, sure. But if you travel around the world and you go to some countries or even developing countries, there are stray dogs everywhere that are not so friendly. So I think as a healthcare practitioner, whoever's listening, like always remember to put yourself in that person's shoes and understand the context even before treating.
Yeah, and I want to actually make one more point here, like kind of demystify or maybe just like educate the public a little bit on something that I've learned.
Hmm.
So I had a case, it was a workplace injury, someone coming to my office, and they were really displaying a lot of the PTSD symptoms, right? And it was like a pretty minor, I mean, I mean, just in terms of for most people, you wouldn't expect those types of PTSD symptoms, right?
Hmm.
But as we're working together, as we're processing, as we're revisiting that experience, guess what? Something very similar happened to this individual when they were 5 years old,
Mm.
right? And I'm going to use a general example that is not connected to a specifics, but say you were at work and someone got injured and they were calling for you and you weren't able to help them, right?
Hmm.
And then someone else came in and then helped them and they were okay at the end of the day. But that all of a sudden is really bothering you and you don't know why and you're not sure, but like you can't sleep at night, you're having like all of those symptoms, nightmares, and you're not feeling safe to leave your house anymore. Like there's a lot of stuff happening. Again, you may not have the memory of it, but this individual did have the memory of it. So let's say similarly, you were boating with your friend and you were 5 years old and they fell off the boat and they were calling for you and you weren't able to help them and they died. They passed away.
Yeah.
Right. So now when we look at this present event within the context of the previous event, now this makes sense. Right. So so I want people to also keep that in the back of their mind. We don't know what everyone has gone through. We don't know what their experiences have been, right? So
Yeah.
it might be like, oh, they're a really picky eater. They don't like the smell of that food. And like, what's the big deal?
Yeah.
Well, guess what? There might be a story to that.
For any practitioners listening, be curious and be inquisitive. Whenever I supervise new clinicians, one of the skills I often find actually somewhat weaker are those really poignant interviewing skills. And it's like always having to be curious and inquisitive as a practitioner, whether it's for therapy or an assessment. Because if we just gloss over everything, yeah, we might get the breadth, but we don't get the depth of one's experiences.
Yeah, being curious and open-minded and
Yes.
non-judgmental,
Yes.
right? To allow the story to unfold, to allow people to feel comfortable expressing something that they might have been hiding for years and years and years, right? Or blocked out. Yeah.
Exactly.
Tons of shame, tons of vulnerability in this work, right?
Yes.
And so,
Yeah. Everybody has a story, and nobody's story is just roses and champagne.
no, and I think trauma and PTSD awareness, like it has really kind of highlighted that even if something happened years and years ago, even if you can't remember it, it
Mhm.
might impact you, right? And
Exactly.
so people's stories, people's lives, those, your childhood, your upbringing, your school experience, all of those things actually matter, right? And for some people, they can matter a lot. And being
Exactly.
able to reprocess that experience can really kind of free up being able to rest and digest and socialize and connect with people again. That
Yeah.
is what I see happen when we do this work the right way.
On that note, I think we're coming up to an hour. I'll start with my takeaway because I know the last episode I asked you first. I think my takeaway is really like I think that was a beautiful ending actually, Dave. Like just really understanding people's stories. You know, what one person, including us as therapists, what we may judge as not being trauma could be trauma to somebody else. So going back to using that non-judgmental lens and cueing in if a certain event was very significant or even traumatic for somebody, that you as an individual, you know, your non-therapist hat, you might think that, oh, that doesn't seem like that big of an issue. But to that person, it might be.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think just being really compassionate, non-judgmental, always honing in and using those spidey senses. I think there's some of the best therapists who I've come across, you know, for whatever reason, I don't know what it is, but they have really good spidey senses. They have that intuition to tap into that.
Yeah, hopefully because they're paying attention to the right things,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
so this trauma informed gives us a lens to kind of look at people's physiological responses as well as what they're saying, you know, what they're doing. And I think just my takeaway or my last comment is just not to do this alone, right? So you can do some of this on your own, but if your experience left you isolated, left you feeling disconnected, it's really important to do this work to re-experience and reprocess those
Yep.
things in a supportive, caring relationship, whether that's a therapist, whether that's a friend, whether that's a caregiver, right? Like it
Yeah.
just, there's a relational aspect that might be really important in terms of repackaging that memory and that experience in the
Yep.
present moment.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. So that'll be our second trauma episode. And no, I'm glad we followed up with it. There's just so much around trauma. And again, thank you to Dr. Janice Dicks for the previous episode on trauma, which really had us thinking about this more. And Dave and I said, okay, let's do a second trauma episode because there is so much to talk about. In the meantime, thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the podcast, as usual, subscribe, follow, like, and really appreciate comments, questions, or even ideas for future episodes. And I know some of those are trickling in, so we appreciate that and thank you. And Dave, have a nice weekend. It's Friday.
Go Blue Jays. Take good care.
Go Blue Jays and take good care.